Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll build a .NET standard class library that lets you manage ASP.NET Core identity users and roles. This code is based on the excellent IdentityManager UI GitHub repo by M. Guinness, an MVC application that lets you manage users and roles. As I just said, it's an MVC application, complete with jQuery and an API controller that does the heavy lifting. But what if you want to embed that functionality in a Blazor application? How about a Windows Forms or a WPF app? That's why I built this class library. It goes everywhere. Everywhere you want to be. Now, this is Blazor Train, so I went the extra mile to build a Blazor Server demo that uses our new class library. You can always put it behind an API controller so it can be accessed in a Blazor WebAssembly app, but heck, you can do that. So, get your cold, burnt coffee ready, because identity management in Blazor is coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train! Alright, so like I do sometimes, I've created a repo at GitHub Carl Franklin Identity Manager Library, and it has both the library and the Blazor Server demo application. It also has this wonderful README that has step-by-step instructions and code that you can copy and paste if you want to build the project by yourself. Otherwise, you can just go here, fork the code, download it, whatever, and use it. So the first thing I'm going to do in Visual Studio 2022 is build a class library project, and it's going to be called Identity Manager Library. So let's just delete this class1.cs file here. We don't need that. And I'm going to double click on the project to bring up the CSproj file. And I'm going to change it from .NET 6 to .NET Standard. I'm also going to add a package, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core. Now this library is going to be completely reusable anywhere where you can run .NET Standard, which is everywhere. We can put it behind an API. We can call it directly from Blazor Server. We can call it from a Windows Forms or WPF application. It doesn't matter. So we're going to add some classes here. The first one is called Application Role. So this is a custom implementation of identity role, which is used to define a role. It has two constructors, an empty constructor and one where you pass a role name. And that passes it on to the base class identity role. And then it has a collection of identity role claims called claims. Next, we're going to add one called Application User. And this is a custom implementation of Identity User with a collection of roles and claims. Next, we're going to create an Extensions class. The Extensions class has one method, getAllMessages, and it's an extension method that takes a collection of IEnumerable of identity error objects and then concatenates all of those errors into a single string. So if you have an IEnumerable of identity error, you can do a dot on the end of that object and getAllMessages will be available. Next, we're going to add one called Response. This is a general response object that tells you whether or not your action succeeded, and a string of concatenated messages. Next, we're going to add Role, R-O-L-E. So this is the model for a role. It has an ID and a name, and then claims. Next, we need a user class. So we have an ID, we have an email address, a locked out string. I know you might think it's a Boolean, but it's a string. We have roles as an enumerable of string. We have claims as an enumerable of key value pairs. Then we have display name and a username. And last but certainly not least, the biggest one, manager. So the manager is what you use to do all the CRUD operations against the ASP.NET Core Identity database. So we are injecting a user manager and a role manager, and these are just types in ASP.NET Core Identity. We have our roles as a dictionary, which is a name key value pair. The key is a string, the value is a string. And then we have a read-only dictionary of claim types. You'll see how we use these. So here's our constructor. We have the user manager and the role manager, which we set. So we get the roles from the database, and then we order them by name, create a dictionary, and then we sort by name. Now we're doing a little bit of reflection on claim types. We get the type, and we get all the static or public fields, and that's in field info, which is an array of field info. And then we set all those claim types as defined in the constants. So now we have our claim types. Next, here's get users. Returns a collection of users from the database. And when you pass in this filter, which is null by default, it filters the users based on partial matches of email and username. So that's all the goo for that. Getting the users, including the roles and the claims. And now we're filtering the list with a little bit of link, ordering them by username. And now we're going to set the user properties, the ID, the email, locked out, the roles, the claims, the display name, the username, and return the result. So you wouldn't realize that so much stuff goes into just reading the data out of the database, but you have to do this stuff. Next, we have create user, passing a username, the name, the email, and the password. And we have some sentries here, checking for null or white space. And if they are not there, we throw an argument null exception. Here's our response that we're going to return. Now we create a new application user object and add it to the database, create async. And then we're going to add the name claim. This is my name, set success, and return. Next is get user, which gets a user, application user by ID. We have a sentry here. We call user manager find by ID async and return it. This is perhaps the simplest one in here. Okay, now we have update user. And I'll just bring this down so you can see the whole thing. We have the ID, the email, whether it's locked, the roles, the claims. We got our sentries here, then our response. And now we're getting the user by ID. User has to be there. We're updating only the updatable properties. Email, lockout, end, and then updating the user, getting the current user roles, adding those roles, getting the claims, adding the claims, remove any claims not specified, and return. Delete is also pretty simple. We pass in the ID, make sure it's there, create a response, get the user, delete the user with delete async. If it succeeded, make happy noises, otherwise error messages. See, there's that get all messages extension. And returning the response. Next, we have reset password. So you know when you reset your password online, it'll ask you to type it twice. Well, that's what this guy is, verify. So you have the ID, you have the password, and you have verify. Of course, they all have to be there. Have to make sure that the password and verify match. Then we get the user, delete the existing password if it exists, add the new password for the user, and Bob's your uncle. Okay, now it's get roles. Now this doesn't get roles per user, this gets all the roles. And then there's a filter so you can partially match the name of the role. And it returns an IEnumerable of role. So we're getting all the roles, including the claims from the database. Now we're going to apply the filter in the query. We're going to create the query and then execute the query, set the properties, and return the result. Next, we can create a role. So the name can't be empty. We have a response. We create a new application role object, create it in the database, update the current collection of roles, and return the response. Now we have update role. So we pass in the ID, the name, and the claims, because those are the properties in the role, right? We get the role by ID. We update the updatable properties, which happens just to be name, and we call update async. And then if everything went fine, we have to get the current role claims, add the specified role claims, and remove any claims not specified from the role. Success, success, success. Then we finally have to update the current collection of roles. Delete role, you pass an ID, it's got to be there. we get the role, we delete the role, delete async. Pretty simple there. And then we update our roles dictionary. So anyway, this does all the heavy lifting for you, this manager. Now to this solution, we are going to add a new Blazor Server project. So I'm going to add new project, Blazor Server app. It's going to be called IdentityManager Blazor Server. And now this is very important. See authentication type here? We're going to drop down that list and pick individual accounts. Now what that does is it sets up your Blazor Server application with all of the NuGet packages that you need to do authentication and authorization. Just so happens we need those too. So there's a bunch of files over here that we need to get rid of. Let me just expand these and then I'll show you. So under data, we're going to delete weather forecast and weather forecast service. We're going to delete counter. We're going to delete fetch data under pages. And we're going to delete survey prompt under shared. Now we're going to go to program and we're going to delete this line right here, add singleton weather forecast service. Next, we're going to right click on the Blazor Server project and select add project reference and select Identity Manager library, which is the only thing in the list. So what we're doing is we're adding a reference to the library from the Blazor project. Next, let's go to Imports.razor and we'll add this using statement at using Identity Manager library. That's good. We're going to update app settings JSON. Just the database name is really the only difference. We're going to call the database Identity Manager. And it's going to be created in LocalDB, where if you go over to SQL Server Object Explorer, SQL Server, expand LocalDB, go to Databases, this is where it's going to go. These are the databases I already have in LocalDB, and it's going to add Identity Manager as a database to that when we get to that step. Finally, we got to add some stuff to program. We just changed things around a bit. You can get the complete contents of this file in the repo. But basically, we're not using identity user, we're using application user. Remember, application user is identity user, but it adds some things to it. Next, we want to right-click on Identity Manager Blazor Server and set it as the startup project. Because yeah. Next, we're going to overwrite application DB context. It's very simple. We're going to complicatify it. All we're doing here is we're adding the relationships between the models. Next, we're going to open the package manager console. I'm going to drop down my default project list and I'm going to pick Identity Manager Blazor Server, right, as my default project. And this is really important because that means whatever I do or whatever I install here, this is the project it's going to be installed to or acted upon. So here I want to execute update-database. So what it just did was it executed the migrations that it had in the template. And if we refresh the databases now, we can see Identity Manager is there, and I'll expand the tables. And there we have them. So this database is ready to rock. How did it know what to create? Well, if you remember, app settings JSON, LocalDB, Identity Manager. You can change that to whatever you want. And then when you run update database, that's the database it will create. All right, let's add some pages over here. We're going to add to the pages folder a Razor component called users. Here we're injecting the manager. And we have a nav link to create a new user. And here we've got an input for the filter, get users. Now we've got a simple table. Now you don't have to do this UI. You can use whatever UI you want. But I'm just trying to keep it simple here. We have a table. And then for each user in users, we're showing the ID, the email, the username, the display name. And then we have the roles for each of the roles that the person is in. Whether they're locked out, we have an edit button that calls edit user, passing the ID. And then this last button here is a delete button, delete user. So looking at the code, we have our users IEnumerable and our filter, calling get users. Get users uses the filter, so we have a filter list and onInitialized, both call get users. And we have a delete user. It's just very simple because the manager does all the work. Let's add another page, roles. Roles is obviously where you list the roles and add a new role. And you can filter the roles just like users. We're showing each of the roles. You can delete roles. The code is pretty simple. We're calling get roles. We have a delete role. It's all very simple because we have a nice library to do all the work for us. Now, we're going to need a checkbox list, a list with checkboxes in it. So in order to add and edit roles for a user, we're going to have to add a custom component based on a blog article that I read called How to Create a Checkbox List in Blazor. And we'll link to that. So to the shared folder, we're going to add a new Razor component called CheckBoxList. And here it is. Now this uses a generic type, T-item. You've probably seen this before on Blazor Train or in your other Blazor travels. If you tend to take other means of transportation, I'm not offended. So T-item becomes the type of item in the list, right? And now we have this data, which is an IEnumerable of T-item. We have the field to be shown adjacent to the text box, text field. The value, which the checkbox will return when it's checked. We have the CSS style for the container. Any child content for the control if needed. So this is pretty cool. And the array, which contains the list of selected checkboxes. And just some code to manage when it's clicked. So that's it. That's a very nice, simple component that we can use now in any Blazor application. So we're going to build a few components. They also are going to need view models. So I'm going to add a view models folder. And to this, we're going to add some view model classes. And the first one is called create role view model. There it is, required name. Next, create user view model. So for the user, we have username, name, email, and password. Finally, we're going to add edit user view model. And this just has an email address. That's really the only thing we can edit. While we're at it, let's add the view models namespace to imports.razor, the using statement. Now we're going to create our components. So let's create a components folder. And the first Razor component we want in here is going to be called create role. Now what's cool about this is you could take these components here, this create role component, for example, you could compile it into a separate Blazor library that uses the IdentityManager library, and you could modify it as your own and use that in your own projects, right? This is just a demo, but you're perfectly welcome to take it and modify and use it as you see fit. Just tell people about Blazor Train, okay? So this is an edit form, and pretty simple. Input text, role name. And then we have this response success, and if it's true, we're going to show role created successfully. And then we have our onCreate role. We call create role with the manager, and state has changed. Now let's do a create user component. Pretty simple. We're having another edit form. Inputs for username, name, email, and password. And we've got our create user, calls the manager create user, passing the username, name, email, and user password. Now remember, these are all on the view model required. So this save button will not call the onCreate user unless all of those things are there. Now let's add an edit user component. And you can see we have the parameter user ID right here, and we have our form, and here's our checkbox list with the data, the text and the value fields, and selected values. Those are the values that come back. So here's our user ID parameter. We have the current user, the application user, our edit user view model, the response, an edit user boolean. We've got a dictionary for roles, a list of key value pairs for claims. And on initialize, we get the current user, we get the roles, all of the roles for the manager. We look to see if the user is in these roles, and if so, we add the roles to selected roles. And the same with claims. We go through the claims, and we add them to our claims. We set the user email, and that's what happens on initialize, so that means all of these things can be shown. The user information, the roles, with a checkbox list, etc. So then when the user is updated, we're calling manager update user, ID, email, locked out, selected roles, and claims. All right, we're finally at the point where we can usurp the Index.razor page for the demo. And it really doesn't say anything. It just says Identity Manager, Blazor Server, Demo. The real power is in the Nav menu. So let's go to Shared Nav menu and replace that. So this has the links to the users page, a create user, a roles and create role, and there you go. Now we're finally ready to run this thing. It might take a minute or so at the startup because it has to, think about it for a bit, spin the hamster wheels, etc. But I'll take all that time out. So here we go. Let's go to the users page. There's no users, so let's add one. Carl at appvnext.com. Carl Franklin, appvnext.com. Password's going to be capital P at SSWORD1. User created successfully. Now if we go back to users, there I am. Now there's no roles. Well, there are no roles, quite literally. So let's create a role. The role name will be admin. I'll save that. Now if you go back to roles, you can see there's one role, admin. Go back to users. Now I can edit myself, and look at that. All the roles that I can possibly add are right there. So I'm going to say admin. Now if I go back to users, under the roles, you can see admin. Now you can add as many roles as you want, and every user can have as many roles as you want. There's no limit. So if I created another role called bottle washer, and I go to users and I edit, I can apply the bottle washer role to myself there as well. And both of the roles are shown right there. So there you go. To recap, we built a .NET Standard class library based on the GitHub repo by M. Guinness to provide CRUD operations to ASP.NET Core identity tables. Then we built a Blazor Server application to make use of this class library to provide a UI to add, list, and delete users and roles. And this is just a basic demo, just to demonstrate how to use the Identity Manager library. But it does not contain everything needed to fully administer users and roles. It's up to you to build your own UI to fully manage users, roles, and claims. And again, go to my repo, Carl Franklin Identity Manager Library on GitHub, and knock yourself out. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. Hey, you can find this code, detailed instructions, and a list of resources, including M. Guinness's Identity Manager UI project, right here on my repo. And if you can't find it, don't email me. I'll be walking through the quiet car with a cell phone jammer. Man, I love it when obnoxious people suddenly think their phones are broken. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.